Putting the Allen Gibson tender together isn't anywhere near as easy as the DJH one, because the DJH one, if you recall, was in one piece, the basic body. This is in 3, and then 4 for the front bulkhead, 5 for the rear, and so on. So several parts. And we must use a mitre block, well, a square block of some description. Another thing you'll notice, that with these being half etched, they're very, very easy to bend. So take great care. That was a slight depression there, was in the packaging. It's very prototypical because these were very old tenders by the time they got to the period we're modelling, and they would have had all sorts of bends. But let's try and get it as straight as possible. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, get my head round how this should go. Press that hard against the back part, and this goes flush at right angles. The way it's designed is that the width of the tender, the end plate, goes inside the frame, of inside the sides. That's very important because it's dead easy to get that wrong. If you overlap like that, your tender will be too narrow. The way it's designed is it takes into consideration the sides, and they're the widest part. So that goes into that position, and that goes into there. And then you just have to line it up and hope. Gravity should hold the first piece in. Now it's difficult to do this job with one tack because you want a nice seam, so I'm going to risk it and hope we get it in one. Let the solder set. I think that's got it. That's better. Clean up you should get a nice, just a seam of solder if that's gone on properly, and a tiny, tiny cusp of brass to remove, and that's about right. You can then clean up with a fiberglass brush. So you should end up with a very, very nice seam along there. You'll find that the wood will slightly stain the brass. You can clean that off. But by using the block, we've got everything square. That's now done its job. Having made sure that our assembly was square, I then fitted it to the base plate, the foot plate, making sure that you get a nice seam of solder all the way along. By ensuring that it was square at the back, then it retains its squareness when put on the chassis. There's still a little bit of cleaning up to do there. Similarly, so the other side, and I'll do that with fine files and the burnishing brush. But it's quite square. If you do get a lean, don't worry too much because it can be sort of jigged slightly. It's very bendy, this brass, and it's very, very easy to get it out of kilter. But that's not too bad. Now, I mentioned ride heights and relative positions of locomotive and tender. I hope you can see there that no adjustment will be necessary on these two elements. The footplate on the locomotive should, on the model, line up with the footplate on the tender. It doesn't always on the real thing. Some never do, they're not designed that way, but 4F certainly. Now it's much, much easier to alter the ride height by packing it up than removing material. So for instance, if the locomotive, say, were appreciably lower than the tender, the footplate, then you would pack up washers or bits of plastic card, brass washers or something, not to such an extent where it goes ridiculously high, but just to take those odd few thou out. But I think you can see that already that's the right height. It's bending in ever so slightly there, so I'll just tease that. Don't, whatever you do, force it. but it's nice and square. It lines up with the locomotive. The next stage is to complete this tender, and it really is no more than stuff I've discussed before. Putting the bulkheads in is the same as fitting the various elements of the locomotive. Check that everything's square. The intermediate ones are no different to putting on cab fronts. The same with the 61XX, which has no tender, and the same with the A2.